Welcome back to another episode of Maritimes and Beyond for Acorn Canada Radio, where justice meets radio. I'm your host, Nichola Taylor. On today's show, I'm delighted to welcome back Randy Hatfield, the Executive Director of the Human Development Council. And today we are talking about affordability, the cost of living crisis and how it is affecting so many people, not just in New Brunswick, but right across Canada and even the world, I guess. So thank you for joining me again, Randy.
Hey, thanks for the invitation. Nice to be with you.
Right. So last time we talked a lot about energy poverty. We're not going to spend the time this time talking about it, but I do want to get your thoughts on one thing, just to pick up where we left off. And then we're going to talk about everything else that's about affordability, really. But for this, NB Power did announce a few weeks ago now that they will probably go again to the EUB, the Energy Utilities Board, in October, to ask for yet another increase, probably applied next year. So what's your thoughts? Are we not at breaking point here, or do you think there's even more suffering to come before that they and the government realize that, you know, something's got to give?
It's a really difficult time for energy consumers, particularly electricity consumers. What will happen in October is that the utility, the NB Power, will present to the Energy Utility Boards a revenue requirement. They'll basically say, this is how much money we will need in order to fulfill our requirements under the Electricity Act, which is to provide electricity in as secure a way as possible and as cheap a way as possible to all residents of New Brunswick. And that's when the battle lines will be drawn. And then interveners, including the public intervener, this revenue requirement that the utility claims it needs will be challenged by other participants and interveners. And, you know, the rigor of the numbers will be tested. The assumptions that the utility makes going forward will be tested, and then the Energy Utility Board will either agree with the revenue requirement or will adjust it in certain ways. And once the revenue requirement is there, the utility will also set out the relevant shares of revenue and how it will seek to achieve that number. But it seems fairly evident going forward that the revenue requirement of NB Power will be larger than the last request, because we have had population growth, we have had increase in demand, we continue to have serious issues about Point Lepreau nuclear generating station and unplanned outages. We seem to have a relaxing of the federal requirement of net zero, but that's still there for 2050. So there are a host of problems and challenges that the utility will face based upon its requirement not only to generate electricity, but to transmit it and then to distribute it. I would foresee near double-digit increases again. Then there may well be a deficit from last year that will have to be dealt with. We're currently facing variance accounts and rates of an additional 3% just to pay for the sins of the last couple of years. So we may not only have, a new round of increases based upon a current cash request, but we may have an increase to pay for sort of past sins as well. The province wants to use electricity as an economic driver and continue to offer low rates. It claims, and I think it's true, that relatively speaking, in an Atlantic context, the rates for NB Power are in that ballpark. But if you're in the stadium watching the ballpark and you're affected and you're influenced, it's pretty hard to sit back and understand that rates, will increase again and again and again. And that's why, in fact, the government has set up a comprehensive review advisory committee for NB Power to look at the utility and to offer some practical and realistic ways forward. And some of those decisions, I think, will be difficult. The province at one time a very strict and aggressive debt equity target that they wanted the utility to pursue. That seems to be a bit relaxed now, but that just pushes down the road a larger debt and a larger debt servicing cost. So, for a host of reasons, I mean, all of the issues that we saw and witnessed at the last hearing are likely to present themselves again. There may be a modest improvement in some of those areas that were represented by 13 panels that the utility put forward, but in some, the circumstances will be at least as dire.
Yeah, none. I don't think any of us are expecting great news coming out of that. And I think the government have to step in and create some kind of rebate program to help people, and just to make sure that people can get through without worrying about how much debt they're going to get into because they're having to pay such high hydro bills. And we did have somebody who came to us a few days ago, actually, saying that they had a hydro bill of $3,000 and it made them homeless, not on the streets, but homeless nonetheless. They're couch surfing right now and they have a 4-year-old daughter. And I feel if nothing is done, we're going to see a whole lot more that happening to a whole lot more people. Government do have some responsibility here to step in and say, okay, we need to put a rebate program in place to help people. And we're just going to see more and more sad stories like that, unfortunately. I just feel that's one huge point that many people are dreading come the cold weather. So, it's something the government...
I agree.
Yeah, they do.
There is a process in the hearings before they begin, and we learned that in 2023, for instance, 13% of ratepayers were in arrears, that 3,500 people were disconnected, that thousands of people were on a waiting list for energy upgrades and improvements. And although we don't have the current numbers, I'd be very surprised if any of those metrics were to be changed a lot. And where we advanced, as we talked before, this idea of a comprehensive energy poverty strategy. And that would require a low income rebate. That is available currently in Ontario. It's discussed in other provincial utilities. It's quite common in Western Europe and in some states in the United States. So we're not talking a radical intervention here. This is not something new. I mean, it's almost a homelessness prevention piece. What we have to be careful of is all of our systems that are causing people to lose housing or to become precariously housed, whether it's our criminal justice system releasing people into homelessness, our health system that would medically discharge people and drop them off at a shelter, or just the challenges of affordability that we'll get into. So it puts renters in a very difficult situation because there's no incentive for landlords at this point to invest in energy efficiency measures. And, and tenants are very reluctant to invest in it. So all the issues that we talked about 2 years ago will still be there. Right now, I don't see things improving in a way that will offer relief to low-income residential ratepayers.
I agree, sadly. I don't. And, we have to watch and wait and see, but I can't see any massive breakthrough coming. And that's what frustrates me and makes me angry for so many people who are struggling out there for a basic need, especially when it comes to winter and, those colder months. Let's move on, though, because we are going to talk about affordability in its generality, I guess, but I mean, we'll pinpoint some things. Like we saw each other a few weeks ago in St. John when the Liberal government announced that the direct tenant benefit will be extended, and this will help an additional, 2,500 households. While we support any extra money going to low-income earners, of course we do, but much more needs to be done. As much as we keep talking about the need for affordable housing, we're seeing housing being built. The question is how many of these units are affordable. What do you think should the government be focusing on here? I mean, I'll reiterate, of course, we appreciate things like this. but it's helping very small amounts of people, and they've got to do something more and bigger to help the people who are struggling. What more should they be focusing on?
Totally unaddressed are deeply affordable units or even affordable units. Well, and I would define affordability as 80% of median market rents. That's the challenge. We don't have enough affordable units in this province. The federal government abandoned the social housing field in the 1990s, and the provinces didn't have the political will or the resources to carry on with social housing or even upgrading and maintaining the current stock that they have. And although you may see cranes on the horizon of the cities in St. John, those cranes are building by and large high-end market rents and units that accommodate and appeal to that particular class. Sorely lacking are the affordable units. I think we can talk about affordability, but I wouldn't want to leave this conversation and not discuss the other alarming feature that seems embedded in the province now, and that is the increase in people relying on social assistance.
Yeah.
Just last month, 113 individuals were added to the social assistance rolls. The month before, it was 223. The month before that, it's 196. There are currently 26,197 cases of social assistance in the province, representing 40,338 people. Now, these are folks under the age of 65 that are relying on social assistance as their principal source of revenue. And I don't have to remind you or any of your listeners about how dismally low the rates of social assistance are, particularly in New Brunswick. The rate for a single employable person was just increased on April Fool's Day, and it now is $675 a month. And that math just doesn't work. That leaves very little to meet all other basic needs. And the supply of affordable housing is much too low, with thousands on a waiting list. So for those on social assistance who aren't in affordable housing, I would defy any lister to tell us how a person can get an apartment.
Exactly.
It just doesn't happen.
No, and sadly we see that a lot as well. I mean, so social housing, I grew up, so we call it council housing in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in council housing all my life. The UK government did a similar mistake to what the Canadian government did, and they just didn't rebuild. Growing up in that kind of housing, and most of the people I grew up with grew up in that kind of housing. So it's a lifesaver. It till now, some of my family members are still in that kind of housing. So it just baffles me. And one of our big things that we are asking the federal government to do is to actually reinvest back into social housing. Lowest figure we expect to see, 50,000 units for the next 10 years into social housing. Because there's just too many people falling through that safety net. And when you look at NB housing and the amount of people trying to get on into it, especially in the last few years, no doubt. And then on top of that, you've got below standard housing for NB housing. It's not maintained well. It's not adequate for people to live in. It's more or less saying that people who rely on social housing from the working class, that's all they deserve. And that attitude just makes me so angry. And I find it appalling, because then we're in this loop and people can never get out of that poverty cycle because they're just kept in it on purpose. I believe they can do a whole lot more. They just have more priorities, that are not helping people who are vulnerable. And that comes from federal government, provincial government, and municipal government. I don't see them doing enough to help people who are stuck in this cycle.
So just to go back to social assistance for a second, you can't get social assistance in New Brunswick until you've exhausted all of your liquid assets, with except $1,000 and maybe a burial policy. And it's you've got to be really poor to get onto social assistance. And there's no way, given the size of the rates and the increase in cost to basic needs, that you're going to get off with any degree of ease or certainty.
It's when you learn things like that, because I don't know too much about it, but when I've listened to you talking about it and the statistics that you were giving earlier, about how many people have applied in the last few months, and that's only the last 3 months, and then how many people are relying on it. It's baffling. It really is. And then these people are expected to do work miracles with the money that they have to live. And I just find it completely cruel. The system is completely cruel. And another thing that we've talked a lot about, and I'm sure you know a lot about, is obviously grocery affordability. It's another, it all interlinks. So it's a growing concern in Canada, with food prices continuing to rise. It impacts many households. More and more people are relying on food banks. Low-income individuals and families are disproportionately affected by rising grocery costs, facing difficult choices between food and other essential needs. What do you think needs to be done here? Because what makes me angry is we see corporates making billions, these big supermarkets making billions. What you could actually be putting a large part of your profits, and it's not really going to affect you, into doing something about it, rather than getting the public to buy a $5 bag to give to the food bank or whatever else it is. It just makes me angry. So, to see people having to struggle. There's a group in Fredericton, you probably have similar in St. John on Facebook, where it's for people to ask without being judged if they need help. And the amount of people that have come in just lately saying, I don't get paid yet, and I've run out of money for food, and I have children. And it takes a lot of pride to be able to get to that point to ask for help. And you can tell they're working people. And we're coming to this where they feel they have to ask strangers to help them for food because their job doesn't pay them enough, and the food is going up, and they have families to feed. And even if they don't, they're just looking after themselves. It just seems so cruel and so heartless.
Oh, food security is a growing issue for a lot of folks. I mean, let's just start by looking at food bank visits, for instance. Between 2019 and 2024, those visits increased by 45% in New Brunswick. Now, I was living in Edmonton in 1980 when the first food bank opened, and it was meant to be a temporary measure to deal with, the recession and the high interest rates of over 20% at the time. And now they're firmly embedded in nearly every community in the country. So not only is food banks usage increased, but so has this notion of food insecurity, this subjective sense of whether you feel secure in being able to acquire sufficient food that is nutritious. And in New Brunswick, between 2019 and 2023, food insecurity rose by 88%. So
Wow.
not only are people demonstrating that by traveling to food banks, we're developing within the province, supply chains and just-in-time sort of transportation challenges that huge multinationals are, and the forklifts, the pallets, the transport trucks, the refrigeration units that are required in communities to maintain all this. It's a huge industry now, and still led in large part to this charitable model that, in my mind, has no place for basic needs. The Consumer Price Index is often used as a crude measure of the increase in the cost of living, but that's based upon a bundle of goods. And if you pull away and disaggregate the components of a CPI, you can see that, for instance, New Brunswick's last CPI in the public record in May was like 0.9%. And you think, wow, we've wrestled inflation to the ground. It's down to less than 1%. But when you pull apart, Nichola, the component pieces, food was up 3.7%. Rent was up 6.9%. Electricity and energy costs were up. The ones that count the most for people who are income insecure, the ones for basic needs, are the ones that are increasing far beyond this CPI index. all you're doing is preserving the purchasing power of an already too low minimum wage. And right now, last year, the living wage in New Brunswick was $24.62. And that's based upon a rather robust national living wage framework that looks at 10 expense categories. It looks at food, it looks at transportation, it looks at childcare, it looks at something called social inclusion, looks at the cost of health, a private insurance plan for health, because I don't think it's outrageous to think that people should have a drug plan. I don't think we're talking about frills here. So if you want, this province or communities within it to be places where people can live with some dignity and to have some choice, we have to increase incomes.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, the math would say you could reduce costs. If you want to make people better off, then reduce the costs that they have to pay or increase their revenues or their incomes. Because we've new floors now for these numbers. There's a new floor for accommodation. There's a new floor for nutritious needs. And the likelihood of, food prices or rents decreasing markedly in the next while is incredibly remote. That's not going to happen. So if that's the case and you want people to be better off, then you're going to have to increase incomes. The minimum wage in New Brunswick is $15.65. I mean, do the math. How many hours would you have to work at $15.65 to afford a decent place to live?
Right. And that brings me nicely on actually to what I'm going to ask you next, because if people, sadly, there's this stigma to the working poor, but it seems to just lately be really bitter and horrible. For example, we launched our latest campaign, AC for All, simply because people need cooling in their homes, and obviously with climate change happening and the hotter and more humid summers, and heat exhaustion, heat stroke is very serious. And, as we saw in BC a few years ago with the heat dome, the number of deaths that caused is particular in seniors, and a lot of them were renting. They were the victims of it. And we've done a big report that we released at the end of May that shows, renters are disproportionately affected by climate change, because the buildings are just not adequately equipped to deal with extreme weather incidents. Anyway, someone posted it somewhere online, and I'm sure you can imagine the comments that came out of people. But I'll just repeat some here, just in case people are wondering. Some person being very helpful, saying fans are only $20 in Walmart. And if you go back to somebody earning $15, what you said, the living wage, how can they afford a $20 fan? And a fan is not going to do anything anyway in extreme heat. Other people saying, stop buying expensive phones, these assumptions. And I just find these attitudes toxic, very bitter, very angry, and usually coming from middle class, as if they're the ones that are the victims. And I just wonder what your opinion is when you must see them yourself. Like, why is it?
Well, it makes me think I should avoid social media. There's something about the tone that people use when they're not face to face with the person. Harari's written another book. His most recent one is Nexus. He wrote *Sapiens*, and he also wrote *Homo Deus*. He's a public intellectual, and his concern now is that there's way too much information and not enough truth. And truth, he claims, is hard to get at because it takes time, it takes resources. You have to sort of parse things and study things. So it's so much easier just to somebody to throw out an opinion or to lay out something that they claim is a fact, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And there's just way too much information. So where do people get their facts? And if it's not face to face, people can be incredibly rude and crude and say things that are just wrong. I think we've got a real challenge in communications. The facts are 46% of wage earners and salaried employees in New Brunswick don't earn a living wage. These are facts. And I defy people to sit with these facts and draw the judgments that they often do. I'm particularly struck and disappointed with and are fearful of the reaction and the blaming of newcomers or of refugees. The backlash there is pretty jarring
Yeah,
in public discourse. I don't know if you found that or you share that thought, but I find it um, quite shocking.
I do, because I think when we first came to Canada, so we moved here 2018. If you compare Canada then to Europe, especially the UK where I'm from, hence why we didn't go. Well, there's other reasons why we didn't go to the UK. I mean, the whole immigration system is pretty racist anyway. Islamophobia, and I'll talk obviously from my own point of view, Islamophobia in the UK and Europe is atrocious. There were so many attacks on Muslim women, visibly Muslim women, and we didn't really see it happening here that much. That's not to say it wasn't. Of course, then we saw the Quebec incident where the Trump supporter went into the mosque and shot worshippers dead. Like, they always target those who they feel won't defend themselves, and obviously somebody praying is not going to get up and defend themselves. And then a few years after that, we saw the incident happen in London, Ontario, where the guy ran down a family walking, Muslim family walking, and again, unarmed with children. So we started to see these incidents, but we've always felt relatively safe here. But in the last election, when you find people jumping on this make Canada great again, make Canada or Canada first, what are you talking about? Canada first from what? Because Canada has always been a country that needs immigrants to build, needs immigrants to grow, have accepted immigrants, usually very welcoming. Again, I'm not saying that the racism and things like this never happened. Of course it did, and we all know how Canada was formed in the first place and so on, to now where you've got a politician, a prominent politician running on put Canada first and doing the Trump rhetoric and things like this, and then you see people posting things like, we don't want Muslims here, or we don't want or you should all speak English when you come here, or we don't want Arabic and we don't want Sharia law. Half of them, by the way, don't even know what Sharia law even means, let alone they have no clue. But you see these and it's hurtful, especially when you see them by people who you never expected to see it from. So that has risen, and then you can understand then why people are using newcomers and temporary workers and students on student visas as the scapegoat to all the problems, because it's just easier to do that than actually challenge those in charge. And when you've got one of those in charge actually using similar rhetoric in the first place, then, it gives the green light to go ahead and be that nasty and be that. And it is nastiness. There's no other word for it. I am in a more better position than some Muslim women because I'm white. So therefore, if I ever felt threatened, I can take off the veil and I'm going to be fine. But somebody else, if she's coming from the Middle East or, somewhere like that, and she take off the veil, which we saw, by the way, after 9/11, there were actually women taking off veils because they were so afraid of attacks. But she can't change her skin color. And that is a big statement if you think about it right there. It is a frightening time. My husband's Egyptian and my daughter's half Egyptian, half British. She's been called a terrorist at her school because she's a Muslim. So, and she was, she's 12. So you can imagine, what we have to put up with because of these kind of attitudes. So it's painful. It's hurtful. We find this province actually quite a friendly province. People usually go out their way to help you. But in the last few years, it's become more and more it's getting to the point where it's getting more and more like Europe, and Europe is not the safest place for Muslims right now. So you can imagine people want to say, oh, Canada's not like that. No, Canada is like that, and it's becoming very much like Europe and Britain is right now, against newcomers, refugees, asylum seekers who are escaping the worst possible things happening to them in their own country to try and get safety. And then you've got people here who will never, ever experience that in their life, sat there from their armchair thinking that they look great by insulting them and putting all the problems that's happening in this country on a very few percentage of people that have nothing to do with it.
I'm sure. We're recording this on July the 2nd, and I'm just going to cite something from this morning's newspaper in St. John from the head of our Economic Development Agency, who reported to the Municipal Growth Committee about newcomers and service providers. And he's saying that one of the main messages that came out of our consultations loud and clear was that racism is still a pervasive problem in this community. He went on to say, but I can tell you, having sat through a lot of consultations we did during roundtable sessions with newcomers, we have a long way to go. After the 2016 census, the alarm bells went off because we were the only province that lost population. And when immigration did start to increase, New Brunswick, for the first time in years, saw an increase in population, which was, lauded by our politicians. But I don't think we did any of the work that was required to sustain it or to embed population growth in an inclusive way in our communities.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, like, we've met some great people, some wonderful people. They might not say stuff, but they just this intimidating look that people can give you. And if you're a woman on your own, for example, going to the shops, you don't speak the language very well, and then you've got some idiot who's used that kind of rhetoric with you, and you don't deserve to be, you don't deserve, how come you're getting stuff and I'm not getting stuff, and all things like this. And sadly, this is what people have to put up with. And again, I'll say it, we're talking about people who have escaped some awful situations that none of us can ever imagine in our life, and they've escaped that probably at the price of being away from their families and friends and obviously the life that they knew, to come here and then to face, people's ignorance and hate. And I just can't imagine how that feels, because I wasn't born into Islam. I chose to become a Muslim, and it wasn't through marriage, and it was all my own doing. And so I can choose how I look and so on, and I can then very easily fit in with an everyday white Canadian person, and I will never ever experience racism because of the color of my skin. And I've only experienced a tiny little bit of what they feel, and that's only because I'm wearing a scarf on my head. So, if you take that off, I'm going to look like anyone else. They cannot, and that's the point. They have to live every day like that, and it's becoming very frightening for some people. It's a reality, and sadly, a lot of people find it easier to pick on those who are more vulnerable. So whether it's through their poverty status, or whether it's because they're not Canadian, they're not white Canadian, or they're not Canadian, or they're the scapegoats. In the last few years, with the emergence of these far right parties, it's scary. It's very scary. And then, of course, with Trump at the helm, it's giving them such a loud voice that it is frightening. So I feel we have a very rocky few years ahead of us. But I think if you are somebody of color, it's gonna feel very intimidating. Very.
Yeah, we see that in poverty rates as well. Racialized communities and newcomers. Arab youth in New Brunswick have poverty rates, by factors over the general population. So, intersecting and looking at data and facts, I think, paint a picture that say, we do have a long way to go. I think we're talking about affordability. I wouldn't want to finish without, acknowledging the presence and increase of homelessness in our communities. there's been a 125% increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness for at least one day. That was over 3,135 people in Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John. Units are scooped up for investment in speculative purposes rather than providing shelter to an owner. Yeah, when you look at the number of units in Ontario, I mean, Toronto and Vancouver, I think I've seen, 25% of them are not owner occupied. So when housing becomes an asset rather than a right, I think you're going to have problems. And we touched briefly on the systemic challenges of introducing somebody into homelessness, whether it is the criminal justice system or the health authority. I certainly have not seen as many individuals and or tents in communities as I have this year. It's far surpassed anything in the past. Homelessness is a really wretched condition to be in. Imagine not having a home. Imagine not having a door and a lock. Imagine all of your personal possessions in a tote that is not secure. And it's just unconscionable that we have as many unhoused people in our communities as we do now. And the answer to that, I mean, we know what to do, but it's going to take a political will and an acceptance of doing things a bit differently that to date we haven't been able to accept.
I don't think we're there yet either. I see a lot of good things being said about certain different aspects of these problems that they'll touch just on the surface, but they don't go deep enough, and they don't want to go deep enough. I'm sure of that, because if they wanted, they can help people out a whole lot more than they are doing or are prepared to do. And then you hear these again attitudes. Well, they want to be homeless. Who wants to be homeless? You've got a roof over your head. You're not going to get cold from the weather. You're not going to worry about where you're going to sleep at night and things like this. Who chooses that? And it reflects on the leaders, because again, they can do a whole lot more if they choose, but I don't see that they want to.
Yeah, I've been impressed with the growing interest in a guaranteed livable income over the years. I often, as a tool of public policy, thought, well, that's too far down the road. That's too remote. I remember studying it in the 70s. But the Parliamentary Budget Office has costed out several options over the last year. The Senate has taken up the issue. Prince Edward Island is interested in embarking on a pilot project using the island as a case study. So, I mean, what I find galling is we know what works. We know that income supports make a difference. We know that the child tax benefit has reduced levels of child poverty markedly. Not to say it's perfect, not to say we have to retool and continue to focus and target. The new disability support benefit is woefully inadequate. The architecture of the program is in place, but the door is now open for, $200 a month. So we know that income supports will make a difference to low-income people, and I can't help but think of the difference a guaranteed minimum would make to families and to individuals. The stress, Nichola, is palpable in communities now. The number of people that are on the edge, wondering how close they are to not balancing the books, to not paying rent, to not paying utility charges, to not being able to eat properly. It's as large a challenge as I've ever seen.
I want to be hopeful, and I want to be hopeful in the sense that, someone's going to come along, not just one person, because I think it's a collective, the work that we do, the work you do, the work that there's many other social justice groups doing. We can make these small changes, and we are able to put pressure on governments to make those changes, because the governments won't do it by themselves. They need that pressure. The systems need changing, but I think first and foremost, attitudes need changing, or they're ignorant to the facts. And, I think there's a lot of hard work got to be put into making that information available to make people understand that nobody chooses this life for themselves where they have to struggle. There's too many people now living on the edge. And you know what? These people with these who are on their high horse, so to speak, they won't ever know what it feels like unless something bad happens to them and they're on that edge, and then suddenly they'll understand. And sadly, we're seeing more and more people fall into that now. So I think there's a whole lot of work that has to be done. If they want to be different in how they approach things, they've got to be braver and they've got to be bolder. And I know they're doing certain things that do help, but again, they're tiny measures. And I think they do have the power to do a whole lot more. It's just a question of whether they want to do that. And that's where I sit with that. So.
All good points. I always think of scale. I mean, latest quarterly population estimates were released not long ago. New Brunswick has 860,000 people. We've got about 2% of the national population. New Brunswick is the only province without a dominant urban area, a big city. And I think in some ways that does hold us back in terms of our advocacy, in terms of our capacity to, it remains a challenge for us. And I guess in times of despair, I think of that famous, political philosopher Fred Rogers, who said, in times like this, you sort of look for the helpers. And I have to tell you, Nichola, I have the utmost regard for the people that work the front line in our communities. It's a tough job when you're dealing with, all the trauma that's in our communities, and you're dealing with it on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. We're very fortunate to have the people doing the work that are doing the work, and they're often precariously employed, and many aren't making a living wage. But boy, they're the only thing that's really separating anarchy from containment, really.
Yeah, I agree, and I think they're doing work that many other people would not do out of choice. And even they must really need to take care of themselves and their own mental health as well, because the kind of things that they must see must be heartbreaking on so many levels. And they're unsung heroes, really. They really are, because it's
during COVID, we went through this time of acknowledging all the heroes, all the essential workers, and that was a short-lived sort of moment of appreciation. I'd love to see that restored again and revived.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, lots of COVID lessons. I think there's enough fodder out there for master's theses for a couple of decades.
But this whole time frame, I think, will be a great one for people in years to come to be studying. I'm going to finish it there, but it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and I hope we can get you on again. I'm sure we will, because I'm sure there are so many things to unpack, and in the next few months, so there's so many things happening for sure. So I'm sure we're going to ask you again. But thank you again for joining me. It's been a pleasure as always.
Hey, I always appreciate your interest, and thanks for the work that Acorn does. It's really quite necessary. There's not a lot of noise in New Brunswick for the reasons we've talked about, scale and size and attitudes. But I think you folks and, others like the Common Front, they play a really important role in pushing the envelope in this community. So thanks to you and your group.
And thanks to you too, because you do also very important work with those reports and advocating for people who really, really need that voice to be heard. So it's really important also. And thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of Maritimes and Beyond for Acorn Canada Radio, where justice meets radio. And I'll speak to you all again next time. Thank you, everyone. Now I have to find the thing.